dive into the chilling world of haunted mirrors, where every reflection could reveal a sinister secret waiting to ensnare you. From the cursed glass of the Driscoll Hotel to the tragic relics of Victorian-era superstition, this audiobook will take you on a terrifying journey through the eerie tales of those who dare to look too closely. Will you be able to escape the whispers of the past, or will you find yourself trapped in a nightmare of your own making? Chapter 1. Reflections of the Dead. In the shadowy parlors of Victorian England, mirrors were more than just ornamental objects. They held a significant place in the superstitions of the time, especially around death. It was widely believed that mirrors could act as gateways, allowing spirits of the dead to remain trapped if left uncovered during a wake. This custom, to cover mirrors after a person's death, became widespread throughout Europe and North America during the 19th century. Failing to cover mirrors after a death brought tales of strange occurrences, stories passed down through families and friends, reported in local newspapers, and recounted in spiritualist circles. These were not just ghost stories, but experiences that terrified the witnesses enough to etch these mirror superstitions deeply into the cultural fabric of the era. One of the most famous Victorian-era paranormal events involving mirrors comes from Stratford, Connecticut, where the Phelps family encountered strange phenomena in their mansion throughout the 1850s and 1860s. The haunting events, documented at the time and widely reported in the press, included strange noises, objects moving by themselves, and, crucially, strange activity in the mirrors around the home. The Phelps family, particularly Reverend Eliakim Phelps and his son, noticed that the mirrors would sometimes reflect things that were not present in the room. Ghostly figures appeared in the reflection, most often a woman dressed in mourning clothes. The Reverend himself was a skeptic at first, dismissing the sightings as imagination. But as the incidents grew more frequent, he took them seriously. Newspapers of the day reported that the mirror in the family's parlor became the focal point of the activity. Witnesses claimed to see fleeting shadows or figures within the glass. The haunting persisted for years and was one of the most documented paranormal events of the Victorian period. While there were various theories about the cause, some suggested fraud, while others believed it to be genuine spirit contact. The activity around the mirrors remained a disturbing reminder of the era's connection between death and reflective surfaces. In London in 1906, an unusual story made its way into the local papers and was later recounted in spiritualist journals. At the Richmond funeral home, an old mirror that had been left uncovered during numerous wakes became infamous among the staff. Employees began to report seeing strange reflections in the glass, figures that seemed to stand behind them as they passed by, but would vanish the moment they turned around. The most chilling incident involved a young mortuary assistant named Alfred who swore he saw the reflection of a deceased woman who had been prepared for burial earlier that day. He described seeing her standing just behind him in the mirror, her face pale and expressionless, staring directly at him. When he spun around, there was no one there. He quit his job shortly after, too disturbed to continue working in the funeral home. The mirror was eventually removed after multiple employees reported feeling an oppressive atmosphere near it. Some witnesses, including the funeral home director, reported seeing faces they didn't recognize reflected in the glass, leading to the belief that the mirror had become a sort of portal for the dead. The funeral home was closed in the early 20th century, but its legacy of haunted mirrors persisted in local lore. Another documented case involving mirrors took place at Belgrave Hall, a grand Victorian house in Leicester, England. The hall gained a reputation for being haunted after the sudden death of Charlotte Ellis, one of the former residents, in 1874. The haunting was first widely reported in 1897, when numerous sightings of a ghostly figure were made by staff and visitors alike. In one particular account, a staff member cleaning one of the large mirrors in the drawing room saw a woman dressed in white standing behind her, reflected in the glass. The figure was still when she looked in the mirror, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Other reports from Belgrave Hall around this time described similar apparitions, often seen in mirrors, as though the reflections were capturing echoes of the past. Belgrave Hall's paranormal activity has been thoroughly investigated in more recent years, with many believing the site to be one of England's most haunted. However, during the Victorian era, these mirror sightings were among the most terrifying aspects of the haunting, leading staff to avoid cleaning or polishing the mirrors for fear of what they might see. St. James Theatre in London, a popular venue during the Victorian era, became the subject of eerie reports involving its large dressing room mirrors. Actors, often alone while preparing for performances, began to report seeing strange faces or figures behind them in the glass. Some claimed to see the reflection of a figure in 19th century clothing, though no one else was present. One actress, whose name was not publicly revealed but was mentioned in the London press, recounted seeing a man standing behind her in the mirror during a late rehearsal. She described him as pale, with dark eyes and a fixed, intense expression. When she turned, the room was empty, but the reflection lingered for several moments longer before fading. The incident so unnerved her that she refused to use that dressing room again. The mirrors were eventually removed and replaced after repeated complaints from actors and backstage staff, though the haunting remained part of the theater's lore well into the 20th century. Chapter 2. The Smiling Man, the Myrtles Plantation Mirror. The grand estate of Myrtles Plantation stands in the humid, oppressive stillness of Louisiana's St. Francisville. Spanish moss drips from the towering oak trees, and the house, with its sweeping veranda and Greek revival columns, looks both beautiful and sinister. It's here that one of the most famous haunted mirrors in America resides, an object shrouded in stories of death, sorrow, and something far darker. The mirror, encased in an ornate frame, hangs quietly on the wall near the entrance. At first glance, it appears unremarkable, just another piece of Victorian decor. But over the years, countless visitors and employees of Myrtles Plantation have reported seeing something far more chilling reflected in its glass. Faces, hands, and figures that don't belong. And, most unsettling of all, the presence of what some call the Smiling Man Myrtles Plantation, built in 1796 by General David Bradford, has long been rumored to be one of the most haunted homes in the United States. Its tragic history is marked by multiple deaths, including the infamous story of Chloe, a slave who, according to legend, poisoned the plantation owner's family, killing his wife and 2 daughters. While much of the Chloe tale is debated by historians, there is little doubt that the house has seen its fair share of suffering and death. The mirror, however, is believed to be tied to the deaths of Sarah Woodruff, the wife of one of the plantation's later owners, and her 2 young daughters. They died suddenly in the mid-1800s, possibly from yellow fever, and their spirits are said to remain trapped within the home. According to local lore, the family's mirrors were not properly covered after their deaths, allowing their souls to become ensnared in the reflective surface. What began as whispers among the locals has since evolved into one of the most famous ghost stories in the region. Visitors have reported seeing the faces of Sarah and her children in the mirror, their expressions frozen in a sorrowful gaze, as if pleading for release. But there's another entity tied to the mirror, one more unsettling, a grinning figure that some have come to call the Smiling Man. Stories of the mirror's paranormal activity have been recounted by tourists, employees, and paranormal investigators over the decades. Many claim to have seen foggy handprints on the glass, pressed as though from the inside. Others describe ghostly figures that appear for just a second before vanishing, leaving behind an eerie, cold sensation. One of the most chilling encounters happened in 2008, when a group of tourists visiting the plantation decided to take photos of the famous mirror. When they reviewed the images later, they were horrified to see the reflection of a man standing behind them. The man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, had a broad, unsettling grin stretched across his face, yet no one had been behind them when the photo was taken. The Smiling Man was not seen in person, only through the camera's lens. This sighting would not be the last. In 2014, a staff member named Jillian, who worked at Myrtles as a tour guide, had her own terrifying experience with the mirror. While closing up the house one evening, she passed the mirror and caught a glimpse of something unusual out of the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a reflection of something outside. But when she turned back, she saw him, a tall figure standing within the glass, smiling. His grin was wide and unnatural, stretching beyond the confines of a normal human expression. His eyes, hollow and dark, were fixed on her. Jillian froze in place, too terrified to move. The figure didn't shift, didn't blink, just continued to smile. After what felt like an eternity, she backed away, refusing to take her eyes off the mirror. By the time she returned with another staff member, the figure was gone, but she swore she felt a presence lingering in the room. One of the most commonly reported phenomena associated with the mirror is the appearance of small handprints on its surface, as if someone or something is trying to press through from the other side. These prints are often described as being too small to belong to an adult, possibly those of children. In 1992, a group of paranormal investigators visited Myrtle's plantation and conducted a thorough examination of the house. During their investigation, they set up cameras in front of the mirror, hoping to capture evidence of the reported hauntings. When reviewing the footage, they discovered what appeared to be faint handprints forming on the glass, despite the fact that no one had touched the mirror during their session. The prints seemed to appear from nowhere and then fade away. Later that same year, another visitor claimed to have watched in horror as foggy handprints appeared on the mirror right in front of her eyes. She had been alone in the hallway, staring into the mirror, when she saw the first handprint materialize, followed by another. As she stepped closer, she swore she could hear faint whispers, though she could not make out the words. The woman, shaken by the experience, left the plantation and refused to return. The apparitions of Sarah Woodruff and her children are often reported as well. Some visitors describe seeing the faces of two young girls reflected in the mirror, their expressions sad and distant, as though they are trapped behind the glass. On one occasion in 2003, a family visiting Myrtle's plantation claimed their daughter saw two other children playing in the hallway, but when she looked into the mirror, the girls were there, watching her. However, when she turned around, the hallway was empty. A similar account came from a couple visiting in 2010. They had been touring the plantation when they stopped in front of the mirror. The wife, feeling an odd chill, took out her phone to snap a photo. When she reviewed the image later, she was shocked to see the faint outline of two figures, a woman and a small child, standing in the background. The figures were not in the room when the photo was taken, and no one else on the tour had reported seeing anything unusual. Despite numerous renovations and changes to the house over the years, the haunting associated with the mirror persists. Paranormal researchers who have visited Myrtle's plantation describe the mirror as a focal point for the activity in the house, a kind of spiritual anchor for the lost souls said to inhabit the estate. Many believe that the mirror acts as a portal, trapping the spirits of Sarah Woodruff and her daughters, as well as other restless entities. The presence of the smiling man, however, remains one of the plantation's most terrifying mysteries. He doesn't seem to belong to the tragic story of the Woodruff family. Some speculate that he may be a darker force, a malevolent entity that has attached itself to the mirror over time, feeding on the fear of those who gaze into the glass. Chapter 3. The Antique Shop Curse, John Dee's Scrying Mirror. Deep in the heart of London, behind glass in the dimly lit British Museum, lies a seemingly ordinary black mirror. To the uninformed, it appears as nothing more than an antique curiosity, a polished piece of obsidian, cold and lifeless. But for those who know its history, the mirror is a chilling relic of the occult, tied to the infamous Elizabethan scholar and magician, Dr. John Dee. Its surface, once used for scrying or communicating with spirits, has been linked to dark and disturbing tales over the centuries. Some believe the mirror is cursed, its energy corrupting anyone who dares come into contact with it. Others insist that it is a portal, a window into the unknown. The stories surrounding John Dee's scrying mirror are well documented, and its effects on those who have encountered it, whether in museums or antique shops, are both terrifying and unnerving. John Dee was no ordinary man. Born in 1527, he was a mathematician, astronomer, and navigator, but it was his fascination with the occult that truly defined his legacy. Dee sought knowledge beyond the physical world, delving into alchemy, astrology, and divination. He believed that he could communicate with angels and spirits, seeking their guidance for both personal power and for the expansion of the British Empire under Queen Elizabeth I. One of Dee's most infamous tools was his scrying mirror, made from black obsidian, a volcanic glass said to be imbued with mystical properties. With the help of his medium, Edward Kelly, Dee used the mirror to gaze into otherworldly realms, contacting spirits that allegedly provided him with cryptic messages and apocalyptic visions. Over time, as Dee's experiments grew darker and more desperate, many believed that the mirror had become a conduit for something sinister, a portal through which darker entities entered his life. Dee's later years were marked by misfortune, and some say the mirror played a role in his ultimate downfall. While Dee's own documented accounts of his scrying sessions were mysterious, the mirror itself has developed an even more chilling reputation in modern times. Stories of those who've encountered it, whether displayed in museums or during its passage through antique shops over the centuries, describe terrifying experiences. The mirror currently resides in the British Museum, where it is displayed alongside other objects from Dee's collection of occult artifacts. For decades, visitors have passed by it, unaware of the mirror's dark history, until they encounter something inexplicable. One such incident occurred in 2012, when a museum guard named Thomas Bennett experienced something that left him shaken for weeks. Thomas had been patrolling the museum after hours, ensuring the galleries were secure. Passing through the room where Dee's mirror was displayed, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and as he glanced toward the mirror, he saw something reflected that froze him in place. A figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette, was standing just behind him, despite the room being empty. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but the gallery was silent and still. When he looked back into the mirror, the figure remained, staring at him through the glass. It was no ordinary reflection. The figure was gaunt, with hollow eyes and an expression that chilled him to the bone. Terrified, Thomas left the gallery and refused to work that area of the museum for months. He confided in a few colleagues, and to his horror, discovered that he was not the first to have seen something unnatural in the mirror's reflection. Other guards and even visitors had reported similar sightings over the years, though many chose not to speak of it for fear of being ridiculed. Before finding its permanent home in the British Museum, Dee's mirror passed through the hands of various collectors and antique dealers, many of whom experienced unsettling events. One such case took place in 1996, when an antique dealer in Paris named Francois Chal purchased a mirror from a private collector, unaware of its dark history. The mirror had been kept in the back of Francois' shop, away from the main display. From the moment it arrived, strange occurrences plagued the shop. Francois, a skeptic by nature, initially dismissed the odd happenings as coincidences. Lights flickering, cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and the faint sound of whispers late at night. But one night, everything changed. While closing up his shop, Francois passed by the mirror and noticed something strange in its reflection. At first, he thought it was his own face, but as he leaned in closer, he realized the face staring back at him wasn't his. It was older, its features twisted in a sneer, and its eyes. They were watching him with an unsettling intensity. He staggered back, his heart pounding, and turned to look behind him, only to find the shop empty. Shaken, Francois tried to ignore the incident, but over the following days, the strange occurrences escalated. Customers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when they neared the back of the shop, and one woman even claimed to have seen a figure in the mirror, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, smiling at her with malevolent intent. Terrified, Francois finally sold the mirror to another dealer, who then passed it on to the museum where it now resides. To this day, he refuses to speak in detail about the object, only saying that it brought him the worst kind of luck during the time he had it in his possession. In the 1970s, Dee's mirror briefly came into the possession of the College of Psychic Studies in London, where it was used for research into paranormal phenomena. The researchers, aware of the mirror's connection to John Dee, were eager to study it and its alleged power as a tool for spirit communication. However, what they encountered was far more than they bargained for. During one experiment, a psychic medium named Helen Lester was asked to use the mirror for scrying. As she gazed into its dark surface, she reported seeing figures emerging from the shadows within the glass. One figure in particular stood out, a man dressed in Elizabethan clothing, watching her with a stern and unblinking gaze. His eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and she described an overwhelming feeling of coldness, as if all the warmth had been sucked from the room. The session was cut short when Helen suddenly collapsed, gasping for breath. She later described feeling as though the figure had tried to communicate with her, but not in words. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread and terror, as if the mirror itself were alive and trying to pull her in. The researchers, disturbed by the incident, ceased their experiments with the mirror shortly after, convinced that it was far more than just an antique relic. To this day, John Dee's scrying mirror continues to evoke fear and fascination in those who encounter it. Some believe that the mirror holds the spirits of those Dee communicated with during his lifetime, trapped within its reflective surface. Others speculate that the mirror itself is cursed, carrying with it the dark energy of centuries-old rituals. Chapter 4. The Mirror in the Attic, New England's Haunted Family Heirlooms. In a quiet, forgotten corner of New England, the Stoddard family inherited an old, ornate mirror that had been passed down through generations, its history a mystery wrapped in the shadows of time. For years, the mirror remained tucked away in the attic of their sprawling Victorian home, gathering dust, its secrets lying dormant. But that would change, and when it did, the family's peaceful life would be shattered by a chilling series of events that spanned generations. This is the story of the Stoddard family's haunted mirror, an heirloom that brought terror to all who gazed into its reflective surface. The Stoddard home had been in the family since the late 1800s, passed down from one generation to the next, along with its curious contents. Among the old furniture, faded photographs, and heirlooms was a large, intricately framed mirror. No one in the family could quite remember how or when the mirror first entered their lives. Some believed it had belonged to a distant ancestor, while others thought it had been bought at auction in the early 20th century. Regardless, it was always there, lurking in the attic, forgotten. The mirror came to life in the early 1970s, when Charles Stoddard and his wife, Lillian, inherited the house from his parents. The couple had recently started a family, with 2 young children, Sam and Emily, running around the house. It was during one of their many explorations of the old attic that the children first discovered the mirror. Propped up against a wall, its glass was covered in a fine layer of dust, yet it was somehow alluring. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. The first indication that something was wrong came from Sam, the Stoddard's 6-year-old son. He had been playing in the attic one afternoon when he came down pale and shaken. When Lillian asked him what was wrong, Sam hesitated, his small voice trembling. "There's a man in the mirror," he whispered. He described a shadowy figure standing just behind him, barely visible but unmistakable. He couldn't see the man's face, but he could feel his presence. The room had grown icy cold, and Sam felt as though the figure was watching him, waiting. At first, Lillian dismissed the story as a child's overactive imagination. But over the next few weeks, Sam's nightmares grew worse. He refused to go near the attic, and every time he passed by the door, he would run, his eyes wide with fear. Then it was Emily's turn. At 4 years old, she wasn't prone to fits of terror. But one evening, as Lillian tucked her in a bed, Emily looked up and whispered, "Mommy, the lights in the mirror are dancing." Lillian, confused, asked her what she meant. Emily described tiny, glowing orbs that flickered inside the glass, swirling and moving like fireflies trapped within. Lillian still didn't believe the children, but something about their fear nagged at her. It wasn't long before she would experience something herself. A few weeks later, Lillian ventured into the attic to clean up. She had almost forgotten about the mirror until she saw it in the corner, its dusty surface reflecting the dim light of the room. As she moved closer to wipe it clean, something in the glass caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just her own reflection, distorted by the grime. But then the reflection shifted. Behind her, a figure appeared, tall, thin, and draped in shadow. Lillian froze, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the attic was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, watching her. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sadness. Lillian could feel the cold creeping up her spine as the woman's lips twisted into a thin smile. Without thinking, she threw the cloth over the mirror and fled the attic, her heart racing. From that moment on, Lillian avoided the attic entirely. The figure in the mirror haunted her dreams, and she could feel the pull of the attic even when she was downstairs. The temperature in the house dropped, and a sense of dread seemed to settle over the family. Charles, who had always been practical and skeptical of such things, began to notice odd occurrences as well. Doors would creak open on their own, and at night, he would hear faint whispers coming from the attic, though no one else was up there. The mirror stayed in the attic for years, gathering dust once more, as the Stoddards avoided it at all costs. But in the late 1990s, after Charles and Lillian had passed away, their son Sam, now an adult with children of his own, inherited the house. By then, the events of his childhood had faded into the past, and he no longer feared the mirror. He and his wife, Laura, moved in and began sorting through the old belongings, deciding what to keep and what to sell. When they uncovered the mirror, Laura was drawn to it. Despite its age, there was something beautiful about it, and she suggested bringing it downstairs to display in their living room. Sam, remembering his childhood fear, hesitated, but he agreed, brushing off his old anxieties as childish nonsense. The mirror's move to the main floor seemed to awaken something dark within the house. Almost immediately, strange things began to happen. Laura started waking up in the middle of the night, hearing faint music drifting from the direction of the mirror. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but when Sam began hearing it too, they both grew uneasy. Then, one evening, Laura was sitting in front of the mirror, brushing her hair before bed, when she saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection. It was a woman, her face familiar yet foreign. Laura blinked, and the figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. Over the next few weeks, their young daughter, Lucy, started speaking to an imaginary friend. She would sit in front of the mirror and have long, whispered conversations with someone only she could see. When Sam asked her who she was talking to, Lucy smiled and said, "The lady in the mirror." She described the woman as kind, but sad, always watching from the other side of the glass. As the activity in the house grew more intense, Sam and Laura knew they had to do something. They called in a local historian, who traced the mirror's origins back to the late 19th century. It had belonged to a woman named Abigail Wentworth, who had died tragically in the house under mysterious circumstances. Some believe she had been murdered by her husband, and her spirit had become trapped in the mirror. Desperate to end the haunting, Sam and Laura decided to remove the mirror from the house. They contacted a local antiques dealer, who agreed to take it off their hands. But even after the mirror was gone, the house remained heavy with an eerie presence, as if the mirror had left behind a residue of its curse. The antiques dealer who took the mirror later reported strange occurrences in his shop, items moving on their own, and cold spots forming near the mirror. Customers who passed by the mirror often felt uneasy, as though they were being watched. Eventually, the dealer sold the mirror to a private collector, and its current whereabouts remain unknown. Chapter 5: The Black Mirror Phenomenon. In the dimly lit rooms of modern paranormal investigations, there is a tool that has grown increasingly popular among ghost hunters and spiritual mediums: the black mirror. Unlike traditional mirrors, these are made of polished black obsidian or glass, their surfaces dark and void-like, resembling an abyss. Known as psychomaniums in occult circles, these mirrors are believed to be powerful conduits, portals to the spirit world, capable of revealing the unknown, the spectral, and the sinister. But what happens when investigators use these mirrors to peer beyond the veil? In recent years, documented cases of paranormal encounters involving black mirrors have surfaced, giving credence to the idea that these objects hold the key to other realms. This chapter explores the eerie experiences of those who dared to look into the dark glass and came face to face with forces beyond comprehension. The use of black mirrors for spiritual communication dates back to ancient times. The practice was revived in the late 20th century by Dr. Raymond Moody, a well-known psychiatrist and author who coined the term psychomanium. Inspired by the ancient Greeks who used reflective surfaces in their rituals, Moody developed a modern version of this technique, designed to facilitate contact with the dead. The setup is simple: a darkened room, a black mirror, and a subject willing to confront whatever might appear. Moody's early experiments, conducted in the 1990s, documented numerous accounts of people experiencing visions of deceased loved ones while gazing into the black mirror. Though Moody's original goal was to provide a therapeutic connection for grieving individuals, paranormal investigators soon saw the psychomanium as a tool for communicating not just with the dead, but with something far more mysterious and far more dangerous. In 2013, a team of paranormal investigators known as the Spirit Seekers conducted an investigation in an abandoned mansion just outside of Philadelphia. The house, long believed to be haunted, had a grim history. It was once the home of a wealthy family that had suffered a series of tragic deaths, including a double homicide in the 1920s. The local legend was that the spirits of the victims still wandered the halls, trapped by the violence that had occurred within its walls. During the investigation, lead investigator Claire Manning brought along a black obsidian mirror, hoping to use it as a tool for spirit communication. Claire had used the mirror before in previous investigations, but this time, something felt different. The house had an oppressive energy, and as she set up the mirror in one of the mansion's many empty rooms, a deep sense of unease settled over her. Once the room was darkened, and only the flicker of a single candle illuminated the mirror, Claire began her scrying session. She stared into the inky black surface, waiting for the subtle distortions or reflections that often accompany these sessions. At first, nothing happened, just her own reflection staring back at her. But after several minutes, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Suddenly, a face appeared in the mirror. It wasn't hers. The face was gaunt, its skin pale and waxy, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to peer straight through her. The figure's mouth began to move, but no sound came out. Then, behind the figure, Claire saw movement, shadowy figures writhing in the background, as if they were trying to escape. Her heart raced as she realized they were reaching toward her, their hands pressing against the glass as though they wanted to pull her in. Claire yanked the mirror from its stand and ended the session abruptly, but the encounter stayed with her. Later, as the team reviewed the footage from their cameras, they discovered something even more unsettling. For several minutes during the scrying session, Claire's reflection in the mirror had disappeared entirely, replaced by the shadowy figures. The investigation was cut short, and Claire has since refused to use the black mirror in her work, convinced that it is a gateway to something dark and uncontrollable. In 2018, psychic medium Laura Harris conducted a black mirror session in the Edinburgh Vaults, one of Scotland's most notoriously haunted locations. The vaults, hidden beneath the city streets, were once home to the poor and the criminal underworld in the 18th century. Many died within the damp, stone walls, and countless stories of hauntings have been reported over the years. Laura, no stranger to the paranormal, had used psychomaniums before, but she had never experienced anything as intense as what unfolded that night. The vaults were already known for their dark energy, and as Laura prepared to begin her scrying session, she felt a palpable tension in the air. Sitting alone in one of the vaults, with only her black mirror and a small flashlight for illumination, Laura began her meditation. Almost immediately, the mirror's surface began to change. The reflection of the narrow, stone chamber behind her disappeared, replaced by a swirling, dark fog. Then, out of the fog, a figure emerged, a man in tattered clothes, his eyes wild and desperate. He didn't speak, but his mouth opened and closed as though he was trying to scream. The air grew cold, and Laura felt a pressure on her chest, as if invisible hands were trying to push her backward. Suddenly, more figures appeared in the mirror: men, women, children, all with expressions of anguish and pain. It was as though she was witnessing the souls of the dead, trapped in the vaults, unable to escape. Laura described feeling an overwhelming sadness wash over her, along with the sense that the spirits were trying to communicate something important, something they needed her to know. But the longer she looked, the more intense the pressure became. She ended the session abruptly, gasping for air. When she emerged from the vaults, she was visibly shaken, and it took her several days to recover from the experience. To this day, Laura believes the Black Mirror allowed her to see the restless spirits of the Edinburgh vaults in a way that no other method could. One of the most well-documented Black Mirror encounters took place at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, a location famous for its haunted reputation. In 2020, a group of paranormal investigators led by Jason Hawes, founder of Ghost Hunters, conducted a Black Mirror session in room 217, the same room where author Stephen King allegedly had the inspiration for his novel The Shining. Using a large obsidian mirror set up on a table in the middle of the room, the investigators began their session late into the night. Jason, along with investigator Steve Gonzalez, sat in front of the mirror, hoping to communicate with the spirits that were rumored to haunt the hotel. As the session progressed, both men described seeing strange lights flickering within the glass, as if tiny orbs were bouncing around inside the mirror. Then the image of a woman appeared. She had long, dark hair and was dressed in early 20th century clothing. She stared at them for several moments before fading away, replaced by the shadowy outline of a man. The investigators later reported that they had felt an intense energy shift in the room, as though something had entered the space through the mirror. The hotel staff, many of whom had their own ghost stories, were not surprised. Room 217 had long been known for its paranormal activity, but this was the first documented case where a Black Mirror had seemingly acted as a portal for the spirits to manifest. For those brave enough to stare into the black void, the question remains, what will you see staring back? Chapter 6, The Captive Souls, the infamous mirror of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Perched on a lonely hill in Louisville, Kentucky, Waverly Hills Sanatorium is a place steeped in death and despair. Originally built in 1910 to house tuberculosis patients, the sanatorium witnessed the deaths of thousands during the height of the disease. Over the years, it has become one of the most haunted locations in the United States, a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and those seeking a brush with the unknown. Among the many terrifying accounts of ghostly figures, shadow people, and strange noises, one object in particular has garnered a sinister reputation: the infamous mirror in one of the sanatorium's upper floors. It is said that this mirror has trapped the souls of the dead, their anguished faces sometimes appearing in the glass, silently screaming for release. Paranormal investigators and visitors alike have reported chilling encounters with this mirror, making it one of the most feared objects within the already haunted walls of Waverly Hills. To understand the mirror's haunting, one must first understand the tragic history of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. During the tuberculosis epidemic, the sanatorium was a place of isolation where patients, often left to die, were kept away from society. The death toll was staggering, and it is estimated that more than 8,000 people lost their lives there. It was a place of pain and suffering, and over time, the energy of those who perished seeped into the walls, the floors, and, as some believe, into the very objects that remain. One of the darkest legends tied to Waverly Hills is that of the Death Tunnel, or Body Chute, a long underground passage used to transport the dead from the sanatorium to a location far from sight. The sheer number of deaths led to rumors that some spirits never left, forever wandering the halls of the decrepit building. Over time, certain objects within the sanatorium became focal points for paranormal activity. And then there is the mirror, its dark history intertwined with the restless souls that refuse to move on. In 2010, a well-known paranormal investigation team, Phantom Seekers, spent a night at Waverly Hills, drawn by its reputation as one of the most haunted places in the world. Lead investigator Ethan Granger had heard rumors about the mirror in a patient room on the upper floor, where patients once lay in isolation, staring into the glass, watching their bodies deteriorate. According to local legend, This mirror was a trap for souls, capturing the reflections of those who died in the room, their faces remaining imprinted in the glass for eternity. Ethan and his team set up their equipment in front of the mirror, the atmosphere heavy with dread. As they began their session, one of the investigators, Jenna, felt an icy chill sweep through the room. She stared into the mirror, her breath visible in the cold air, and saw her reflection begin to distort. Her own face seemed to blur and stretch, but what appeared next terrified her beyond reason. A face not her own. A gaunt, pale figure emerged from the darkness of the mirror, its hollow eyes staring out from the glass. It was the face of a man, his expression twisted in agony. His mouth opened as if he were silently screaming, and for a moment, Jenna swore she could feel his despair as if it were her own. Panicked, she turned away from the mirror, but the image lingered in her mind long after the investigation was over. The team reviewed the footage the next day. To their horror, the camera captured the figure Jenna described. For nearly 30 seconds, the face appeared in the glass, a silent specter trapped in its reflective prism. Ethan and his team were left shaken, convinced that the rumors about the mirror were true. It was not just haunted, but a portal to the tormented souls that still roamed Waverly Hills. In 2014, during one of Waverly Hills' public tours, a visitor named Rachel McAllister had a terrifying encounter with the infamous mirror. Rachel, a self-described skeptic, wasn't expecting much from the tour. She had heard the ghost stories, but she didn't believe in such things until she came face to face with something she couldn't explain. As the tour group reached the room with the mirror, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The guide mentioned that visitors often saw strange things in the glass, and Rachel, curious but unconvinced, moved closer to inspect it for herself. She stared into the mirror, her own reflection staring back at her. But then something shifted. Behind her, in the reflection, a dark shape began to form. Rachel blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the figure grew more defined. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair long and stringy, draped in what looked like an old hospital gown. The woman's eyes locked onto Rachel's, filled with sorrow and anger. In that moment, Rachel swore the temperature in the room dropped. She turned quickly to see if anyone was standing behind her. There was no one. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. Rachel fled the room, her heart pounding in her chest. To this day, she cannot explain what she saw, but she's certain it wasn't a trick of the light. Something or someone was in that mirror. In 2017, a well-known psychic medium named Lorraine Thompson visited Waverly Hills with a group of paranormal researchers. Lorraine had a long history of working with haunted locations, but she had never encountered anything as powerful as what she experienced that night in front of the mirror. As soon as she entered the room, Lorraine felt an oppressive energy radiating from the glass. She described it as a black hole sucking in the energy around it. She approached the mirror cautiously, sensing multiple presences trapped within. Lorraine later explained that she felt as though she was standing in the presence of countless souls, all crying out for help, their voices muffled by the barrier of the glass. When Lorraine looked into the mirror, she saw faces, dozens of them, pressing against the inside of the glass as though they were trapped behind it. Some were faint, barely discernible, while others were shockingly vivid. One face, in particular, stood out, a man with sunken eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. Lorraine said the man's face radiated despair, his eyes pleading with her to free him. She stepped back, overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. Lorraine later claimed that the mirror at Waverly Hills was not just haunted. It was a prison for the souls of the dead, their spirits bound to the glass by some unknown force. She urged the investigators to cover the mirror and never use it again, warning that it was too dangerous to continue exploring its depths. For those brave enough to visit Waverly Hills and stand before the infamous mirror, the question remains, what or who will you see staring back at you? Chapter 7. The Hotel of Horrors. The Driscoll Hotel Mirror in Room 525. The Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, stands as a grand monument to history and luxury. But beneath its polished marble floors and opulent decor, it hides a chilling legacy of death and despair. Built in 1886 by cattle baron Jesse Driscoll, the hotel has long been rumored to be haunted. Over the years, guests and staff alike have reported eerie occurrences, strange noises in the hallways, unexplained cold spots, and ghostly apparitions wandering the halls. Yet, of all the ghost stories tied to the Driscoll, the most disturbing center around room 525 and the large mirror that hangs within. This mirror has become infamous among ghost hunters and thrill seekers alike, with many claiming it acts as a window into the supernatural. Guests who have stayed in room 525 tell of reflections that don't match reality, of figures appearing behind them in the glass, only to vanish when they turn around. Some have even sworn they saw the faces of long-dead women, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage, staring out from the depths of the mirror. These unsettling encounters, paired with the room's grim history, have solidified its reputation as one of the most haunted places in Texas. The story of room 525 is steeped in tragedy. According to local legend, in the early 1900s, 2 women died by suicide in this very room under eerily similar circumstances. Both women were brides-to-be, both distraught over broken engagements. It's said that each woman locked herself in the room, only to be found dead by the hotel staff days later, their bodies cold and lifeless in the bed, a pistol lying on the floor beside them. Though the official records of these deaths have been lost to time, the stories persist, passed down through generations of hotel employees and visitors alike. Some say the spirits of these women still haunt the room, forever bound to the place where their lives ended so tragically. And the mirror, an elegant, gold-framed relic of the hotel's early days, is said to hold their restless souls, trapping them in its reflection. In 2014, a woman named Sarah Jenkins checked into the Driscoll Hotel for a weekend getaway. She had heard about the hotel's haunted reputation, but wasn't particularly superstitious. Room 525 was the only available room, and despite its dark past, Sarah thought nothing of it. After a long day of sightseeing, she returned to her room, exhausted. As she prepared for bed, she noticed the large mirror on the wall, its surface polished to perfection, reflecting the warm glow of the room's lights. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Around 2 a.m., she sat up in bed, feeling a strange sense of unease. Her gaze drifted toward the mirror. At first, she saw only her own reflection, her tired face staring back at her. But then, as she watched, the reflection began to change. Another figure appeared in the mirror, standing just behind her. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair tangled and her face pale. The woman's eyes were hollow, filled with a deep, aching sadness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the figure was looking directly at her. Panicked, Sarah whipped around, expecting to see someone standing in the room. But there was no one. The room was empty, silent except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. When she turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone. Shaken, Sarah spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, too frightened to go back to bed. The next morning, she checked out of the hotel, vowing never to return. To this day, she swears the woman in the mirror was one of the spirits tied to room 525. In 2017, a couple on their honeymoon, Jacob and Emily Turner, decided to stay at the Driscoll Hotel. They had heard the ghost stories, but like many before them, they were more intrigued than scared. Room 525 had become a sort of attraction for those seeking a brush with the supernatural, and Jacob, ever the skeptic, was eager to prove the legends wrong. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second night, things took a terrifying turn. Emily had fallen asleep, but Jacob remained awake, scrolling through his phone while lying in bed. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement in the mirror. At first, he thought it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But as he looked closer, he saw a shadowy figure standing near the bathroom door, visible only in the mirror. The figure was a woman, her face obscured by darkness. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine as he watched her slowly move toward the bed, her steps silent, her presence unnerving. But when he turned to look at the room itself, there was no one there. Only the reflection in the mirror showed the woman. Jacob shook Emily awake, his voice filled with panic. As she opened her eyes, the figure in the mirror vanished. Emily thought he was overreacting, dismissing his fear as a product of exhaustion. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He insisted they leave the hotel that night, and they checked out before sunrise, cutting their honeymoon short. In 2020, a team of paranormal investigators from Austin Ghost Hunters conducted an overnight investigation in room 525. Armed with cameras, EMF detectors, and digital recorders, they hoped to capture evidence of the supernatural activity that so many guests had reported over the years. As the night wore on, the team focused their attention on the mirror, setting up cameras to monitor it closely. Around 3 a.m., the equipment began to pick up strange readings. The EMF detector spiked, indicating a strong presence in the room. Moments later, the temperature dropped drastically, and the air felt thick with an unseen force. Suddenly, one of the investigators, Lisa Parker, gasped as she looked into the mirror. There, in the reflection, was the faint outline of a woman's face, her features gaunt and ghostly. Lisa's hands trembled as she stared at the figure, frozen in fear. The other investigators rushed over, but by the time they looked into the mirror, the face had disappeared. When reviewing the footage the next day, the team was shocked to find that the cameras had captured the same face Lisa had seen. For several seconds, the image of a woman's face appeared in the mirror, her eyes dark and lifeless, before fading away. The team concluded that room 525's mirror was indeed a focal point for paranormal activity, possibly tied to the tragic deaths that occurred in the room long ago. The chilling stories shared here serve as a reminder that some reflections may hold more than just your image. Have you encountered a haunted mirror or experienced the supernatural? We invite you to share your own spine-tingling tales in the comments. And don't forget to spread the word about this audiobook to fellow horror enthusiasts who dare to peer into the unknown.